A nation is shaped by its leaders. The goals of good leadership should be service to humanity, but too often our leaders turn towards self-serving goals of money and power. When leaders betray and sacrifice their citizens repeatedly for 3 or 4 generations, a democratic society may begin to decay, then lose its way and descend into an authoritarian state, even when the vast majority of its citizens still believe in the ideals of their democracy. After kerosene, a flammable hydrocarbon oil, was found in the 1850s to be useful in lighting homes instead of candles, a mad rush began for control of petroleum, from which kerosene was distilled. In the infancy stages of petroleum exploration, drills were pounded into the ground in order to break through to oil pockets, which lay beneath the surface of the earth. Pennsylvania emerged as the first major petroleum-producing state, where oil rigs protruded from the countryside. A mad rush to strike oil ensued as thousands of men sought their fortunes in the lamp oil industry. In 1862, during the Civil War, an agricultural commodities distribution company from Cleveland, Ohio, Clark and Rockefeller, entered the oil refining business. After many oil wildcatters had successfully discovered oil, the glut of supply drove down the price of oil to the point where the wood slat barrels were worth more than the oil they held. Kerosene sold for less than it cost to extract crude oil from the earth. A group of refiners formed a cartel which began to regulate kerosene supply and crude oil production, and this benefited Clark and Rockefeller's Standard Works Company in dramatic fashion. Many oil drillers and refiners went bankrupt, and so Clark was willing to sell out to John D. Rockefeller in 1867. Rockefeller and his cartel of oil refiners, through Freemasonry connections, received secret financing from the Passeur banking syndicates via the National City Bank of Cleveland. Daniel Passeur was the highest of French nobility, having changed his name from Crown Prince Louis, son of Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI. Their union was a marriage of Austrian and French aristocracy, but a rival banking syndicate out of Germany engineered the French Revolution of 1789 through the Freemasons and the Bavarian Illuminati. Prince Louis' parents lost their lives, but he retained their hidden fortune. After being smuggled out of France to a fortress on the Rhine, Louis arrived in England in 1804, protected by King George III, and was finally relocated to the United States. The royal paymaster of France, George Passeur, became George Bayshore and was given 600 acres in North Carolina by King George III. The prince bought gold mines through a trustee, including the Gold Hill Mining Company, and also began to finance and lease railroads with the advent of the steam engine. Passeur's Lancaster Railway, through the Alabama Mineral Company, financed Rockefeller and Standard Oil, Henry Ford's company, and many other concerns including Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, General Motors, Boeing, Western Union, and AT&T. The Passeur's Empire Bank of Lancaster became the North Carolina Bank, and then Nations Bank, which has now become Bank of America. Another trustee of the Pasteur family was the frontman J.P. Morgan. Two books that detail these hidden alliances are David Icke's The Biggest Secret and Jim Marrs' Rule by Secrecy. Rockefeller, with this additional financing, incorporated Standard Oil Company of Ohio in 1870 and then formed a new partnership which included Henry Flagler and Jay Gould. Flagler and Gould's railroad industry connections helped Rockefeller when Gould created the Allegheny Transportation Company for moving crude oil to Standard in the most cost-efficient manner. By increasing the capacity of their trains to haul oil and by monopolistically gaining control of all crude oil transportation, the cabal became unspeakably powerful. An economic depression began in 1873 with the collapse of international banker J. Cook and Company that allowed Rockefeller to swoop in and buy up scores of bankrupt companies with oil field assets and oil refineries at pennies on the dollar, dramatically increasing Standard Oil's cash flow. By 1875, only 8 years after his buyout of Clark, the ruthless Rockefeller controlled nearly 80% of all oil distribution in the United States by 1. Limiting crude oil drilling and production, and 2. Limiting the amount of oil being refined in order to inflate the price of all oil products. Rockefeller controlled roughly 75% of all of the oil refining in the world when in 1879 Standard Oil set its sights on the Russian Baku oil fields. By 1880, Rockefeller owned or controlled 95% of all oil produced in the United States. The railroads, which had been the titans of commerce up until that time, fell to Rockefeller's leveraged power, as did gradually the government of the United States, which was manipulated by Rockefeller through his vast wealth and influence. The single greatest power in American industry had congealed, Standard Oil, controlled by one single man, John D. Rockefeller, whose evil business practices led mothers to warn their children to behave, or Rockefeller will get you. Having a stranglehold over the petroleum and kerosene industry for nearly 50 years gave Rockefeller unchecked power over the citizens of the United States, power greater than wielded by U.S. presidents, military generals, or other captains of industry. By 1887, Standard Oil replaced the Bell Telephone Company as the largest corporation in America. Rockefeller made and broke as many political careers as he absorbed bankrupt oil companies, and for all intents and purposes, he had Capitol Hill in his hip pocket. Had Congress managed to set forth anti-monopoly legislation and restraints on the oil industry during those years and enforced such legislation, the course of our industrial development may have progressed less monopolistically. But after 50 years, which were early in the development of our young democracy, Rockefeller and his cabal were exerting a totalitarian influence over the economy and political direction of the United States. Considering the fact that Germany evolved as a center of banking dynasties with armies of mercenaries for hire, it is curious that in Nuremberg in 1561 there were great sightings of cylindrical cigar-shaped UFOs as depicted in this 1561 Nuremberg broadsheet. It is also curious that nearly identical sightings of cigar-shaped UFOs occurred in Texas just before the Spindletop oil discovery in Beaumont, Texas, at the turn of the 20th century, which proved that Texas rested upon an ocean of oil. Curious because this conjunction of oil, banking, and military control and UFOs would become dominant themes in the middle of the 20th century. The great airship mystery of 1896 and 1897 began on November 17, 1896, when several hundred residents of Sacramento, California observed a giant oblong airship. As the months went by, sightings were later made by thousands of other witnesses across the United States, some of whom noted speeds in excess of 200 miles per hour, much faster than any form of transportation at that time. Than 7 years before the first dirigible flight in the U.S. in 1904. From April 15th to 19th, 1897, reports were coming in from all over Texas, as reported in the Houston Post and the Dallas Morning News. These sightings culminated on April 17, 1897, 20 miles northwest of Fort Worth, Texas, in the small town of Aurora, where an airship hit a windmill of one Judge Proctor, according to the Dallas Times-Herald newspaper article by E. Hayden, appearing 2 days later on the 19th. The resulting explosion scattered debris of the airship for several acres, and quoting from the article, "The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one aboard, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world." The article continues, "Papers found on his person, evidently the records of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. This ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal. The town today is full of people who are viewing the wreckage and gathering specimens of strange metal from the debris." Little known to the public is the fact that the inventor of the horseless carriage road engine was not Henry Ford, but one George B. Selden. Selden sold his patent from 1895 to the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers, and the companies in the fledgling industry were required to pay only 1% of their yearly earnings to this association. Henry Ford refused to abide by the Selden patent, and was quoted as saying that Selden and his patent can go to hell. Rockefeller took an interest in Ford, whose case was lost when the court decided in favor of the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers. Rockefeller came to Ford's defense with plenty of money and legal counsel, and when Ford appealed, the Court of Appeals overturned the previous decision, ruling in favor of Ford. The invention by Nikola Tesla of the AC induction motor around 1900 dealt a serious blow to Rockefeller and Ford's plan for an automobile industry that would rely heavily on crude oil refined into gasoline. This combination of a combustion motor and its need for gasoline could create a fortune for Ford and rescue Rockefeller from the falling price of kerosene due to the advent of electricity. Tesla's invention would create cars running on electricity and topple the giant, and using Ford and Thomas Edison, who tried to prove that AC was a danger, Rockefeller managed to turn the automobile industry towards combustion engines and gasoline. Ford's Model T became a hit, he became extremely wealthy, and Ford became a huge employer of labor in Michigan, a labor force he ruled over in a heavy-handed, authoritarian fashion. On November 18, 1906, after years of public outrage, the Justice Department finally filed suit in federal court to dissolve Standard Oil. Over 12,000 pages of testimony and nearly 1,400 exhibits were part of the case against Rockefeller. On August 3, 1907, U.S. District Court Judge Kennesaw M. Landis fined Standard Oil $29.24 million and ordered that Standard Oil be broken up into 7 separate corporations. Standard Oil appealed Judge Landis's decision, and later, Federal Appellate Court Judge Peter S. Groscup revoked the fine. However, the ruling on the breakup of the company still stood. Even though this is what Rockefeller wanted, he played the victim and planned an appeal. Standard Oil took the breakup case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward White ordered Rockefeller to dismantle Standard Oil into 7 separate corporate entities. However, Rockefeller was not ordered to divest himself or his shareholders of any of their properties. Now, Rockefeller owned 6 giant oil companies and 1 large petrochemical company. His wealth had simply been grouped differently, and he had beaten the system and avoided paying any fines whatsoever. Many senators and congressmen were dismayed, knowing that the Supreme Court had behaved exactly how Rockefeller wanted. This allowed for the appearance of fair competition, eliminated any future legal matters regarding monopolistic behavior, and yet allowed Rockefeller to retain all his holdings and wealth, and gave him the cover to diversify into other sectors of industry. 7 years before the first dirigible flight in the U.S. in 1904. From April 15th to 19th, 1897, reports were coming in from all over Texas, as reported in the Houston Post and the Dallas Morning News. These sightings culminated on April 17, 1897, 20 miles northwest of Fort Worth, Texas, in the small town of Aurora, where an airship hit a windmill of one Judge Proctor, according to the Dallas Times-Herald newspaper article by E. Hayden, appearing 2 days later on the 19th. The resulting explosion scattered debris of the airship for several acres, and quoting from the article, "The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one aboard, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world." The article continues, "Papers found on his person, evidently the records of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. This ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal. The town today is full of people who are viewing the wreckage and gathering specimens of strange metal from the debris." Little known to the public is the fact that the inventor of the horseless carriage road engine was not Henry Ford, but one George B. Selden. Selden sold his patent from 1895 to the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers, and the companies in the fledgling industry were required to pay only 1% of their yearly earnings to this association. Henry Ford refused to abide by the Selden patent, and was quoted as saying that Selden and his patent can go to hell. Rockefeller took an interest in Ford, whose case was lost when the court decided in favor of the Association of Licensed Automobile Manufacturers. Rockefeller came to Ford's defense with plenty of money and legal counsel, and when Ford appealed, the Court of Appeals overturned the previous decision, ruling in favor of Ford. The invention by Nikola Tesla of the AC induction motor around 1900 dealt a serious blow to Rockefeller and Ford's plan for an automobile industry that would rely heavily on crude oil refined into gasoline. This combination of a combustion motor and its need for gasoline could create a fortune for Ford and rescue Rockefeller from the falling price of kerosene due to the advent of electricity. Tesla's invention would create cars running on electricity and topple the giant, and using Ford and Thomas Edison, who tried to prove that AC was a danger, Rockefeller managed to turn the automobile industry towards combustion engines and gasoline. Ford's Model T became a hit, he became extremely wealthy, and Ford became a huge employer of labor in Michigan, a labor force he ruled over in a heavy-handed, authoritarian fashion. On November 18, 1906, after years of public outrage, the Justice Department finally filed suit in federal court to dissolve Standard Oil. Over 12,000 pages of testimony and nearly 1,400 exhibits were part of the case against Rockefeller. On August 3, 1907, U.S. District Court Judge Kennesaw M. Landis fined Standard Oil $29.24 million and ordered that Standard Oil be broken up into 7 separate corporations. Standard Oil appealed Judge Landis's decision, and later, Federal Appellate Court Judge Peter S. Groscup revoked the fine. However, the ruling on the breakup of the company still stood. Even though this is what Rockefeller wanted, he played the victim and planned an appeal. Standard Oil took the breakup case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and on May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward White ordered Rockefeller to dismantle Standard Oil into 7 separate corporate entities. However, Rockefeller was not ordered to divest himself or his shareholders of any of their properties. Now, Rockefeller owned 6 giant oil companies and 1 large petrochemical company. His wealth had simply been grouped differently, and he had beaten the system and avoided paying any fines whatsoever. Many senators and congressmen were dismayed, knowing that the Supreme Court had behaved exactly how Rockefeller wanted. This allowed for the appearance of fair competition, eliminated any future legal matters regarding monopolistic behavior, and yet allowed Rockefeller to retain all his holdings and wealth, and gave him the cover to diversify into other sectors of opportunity. Oil stocks were already gaining because of the automobile industry growth, and after the Supreme Court decision, Standard Oil stock burst upward, making Rockefeller immediately even more wealthy and powerful. Rockefeller and Standard Oil still controlled 70% of the oil refining in the United States, and there were no more legal hurdles to face. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was groomed in a privately owned, exclusive Rockefeller school called the Browning School, and then attended Brown University. In 1901, he married the daughter of Senator Nelson Aldrich of Connecticut, and was later in charge of the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company when the United Mine Workers of America staged a 14-month strike against the Rockefeller Company. On April 20th, 1914, an assault on the striking coal miners was ordered, and during the attack by the Colorado National Guard on a tent colony of the miners and their families at Ludlow, a battle ensued claiming the lives of 17 miners and family members, 3 guardsmen, and a bystander. This demonstrated the tactics of the Rockefeller establishment. Rockefeller Jr. was made to testify for 3 days to a chairman of the Commission on Industrial Relations about the Ludlow massacre. The consequences against the Rockefellers were negligible, but not so for the victims and their families. The Magna Carta of Great Britain stated that the charging or collecting of interest carried the death penalty. It was not until William the Orange of the Netherlands of the Habsburg bloodline, who married Queen Mary and created the Bank of England in 1694, that the Magna Carta was circumvented in Great Britain. Central banks owned by the Habsburgs had already been spawned in other countries, like the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609 in the Netherlands, the Bank of Hamburg in 1619 in Germany, and the Bank of Sweden, formed in 1661. These Habsburg banks were enriched by the fiat principle of lending money which existed on paper, only minimally backed by gold. This money out of air was then lent to governments, which were charged interest on this debt through taxation of its citizens, thus empowering the banking families as overlords. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, created the Bank of the United States, which was privately owned and lent money to the United States, creating immediate debt, but it caused so much poverty and rebellion that it was shut down. However, the Second Bank of the United States was created to fund the War of 1812, owned by the Bauer Rothschilds family of Frankfurt, Germany. Germany had also lent money and mercenaries out during the Revolutionary War of the United States. In 1832, President Andrew Jackson vetoed a bill to extend the charter of a Rothschild's Second Bank of the United States, from which the U.S. had borrowed monies to wage the War of 1812. Jackson denounced the central bank as unconstitutional and a curse to a republic, inasmuch as it is calculated to raise around the administration moneyed aristocracy dangerous to the liberties of the country. The Rothschilds family retaliated when in 1835 an assassination attempt was made by Richard Lawrence. The attempt failed, and Jackson successfully pulled the United States funds out of the Second Bank. Jacob Rothschild's puppets in the Senate censured Jackson, but the censure was annulled in 1837, and by the time Andrew Jackson had left office, he had completely eliminated the entire national debt. A stepping stone to European banking control of the U.S. came with the National Banking Act of 1863 during the Lincoln administration, but it was oil profits that catapulted their cartel into the stratosphere of power. When the Spindletop oil field discovery was stolen from Higgins by Lucas and Andrew Mellon's bank, Gulf Oil was born, further enriching the banking and oil cartel. The Warburg family, represented by Felix and Paul Warburg, consolidated large-scale banking operations in New York City in 1901, where they purchased partnerships in the investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Rockefeller crony Jacob Schiff was a senior partner. The German banker Paul Warburg, representing the Habsburgs and centuries-old European banking families, began advocating for central banking in the United States as early as 1907, propagandizing in the New York Times with articles like "A Plan for a Modified Central Bank." A clandestine meeting of several top bankers occurred on the premise of duck hunting on Jekyll Island off of Georgia on 22, 1910. A day that 53 years later would end in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. But on this evening at the home of J.P. Morgan, who was the frontman for the Pasteur Empire, these men conspired and concocted the principles for the legislation which would become the Federal Reserve. The participants were Frank A. Vanderlip, to become president of New York's National City Bank, representing the Rockefellers and Jacob Schiff firm called Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Abraham Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the United States. Henry P. Davison, Senior Partner of J.P. Morgan Company. Charles D. Norton, President of First National Bank of New York, another J.P. Morgan-controlled bank. Benjamin Strong, another J.P. Morgan partner who became the New York Fed's first governor. Paul Moritz Warburg, Kuhn, Loeb and Company partner, and a member of the infamous Warburg del Banco Venice banking dynasty, which later moved into Germany and the Netherlands as M.M. Warburg Banking Company, the family that helped create the Bank of England against the laws of the Magna Carta. Nelson W. Aldrich, Rhode Island Senator, Chairman of the National Monetary Commission, and father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr. This Jekyll Island gang, led by J.P. Morgan and the centuries-old European banking elite, engineered a series of public panics, including the Panic of 1907, as they had done in 1873. Rumors were reported through the likes of William Randolph Hearst's newspaper Empire, and Hearst became a large proponent for reforms and a public spokesman for the creation of a Federal Reserve. The Aldrich Plan, as it was known, was attacked by many who saw that it benefited Wall Street bankers, but a second alternative, the real game plan, lay in wait, proposed by Congressman Carter Glass of Virginia, called the Federal Reserve Act. The new bill had sections entirely identical to the Aldrich Plan, but the hoopla confused the public, many of whom were tricked into supporting the Federal Reserve Act because it appeared not to benefit the Wall Street bankers. The Jekyll Island Group insisted on making the Federal Reserve appear as if it was an official agency of the United States government, when it was not, nor ever has been. The presidential election in 1912 would decide the fate of the Federal Reserve Act. Rockefeller and Morgan's choice, Woodrow Wilson, was engineered to victory by splitting the popular vote between Republican William Howard Taft, who promised to veto the act, and Progressive Party candidate Teddy Roosevelt, whose campaign was financed by associates of J.P. Morgan. With Woodrow Wilson as their presidential puppet, Wall Street and European bankers radically altered our laws and even our Constitution. Through financial contributions to senators and congressmen, Rockefeller used all his tools to consolidate their power. Rockefeller Jr.'s father-in-law, Rhode Island Senator Nelson Aldrich, led a group of politicians that pressured the legislative branch of government to accept the 16th and 17th Amendments. Amendment 16 of the United States Constitution authorized income taxes in their present form and was ratified on February 3, 1913. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration, states the amendment, overturning all the principles of taxation without representation on which basis was fought the Revolutionary War. The European banking community centered in London had finally won the Revolutionary War. So the wealthiest could buy Senate seats in order to control all future legislation. Amendment 17 of the United States Constitution was ratified on April 8, 1913, and first in effect for the election of 1914. It amended Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, and it changed laws towards direct election of senators by the people of a state, rather than their election or appointment by a state legislature as the Founding Fathers had designed. Now, money could buy seats on the Senate, which was vital to the banking cartel because it is the Senate that decides which legislation from the House would become law. While neither amendments have been constitutionally ratified, the courts to this day do not challenge their legality. Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh, father of the famous aviator, warned the country in 1913 that the Federal Reserve Act, quote, establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs the invisible government by the money power will be legitimized. The new law will create inflation whenever the trusts want inflation. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. The Federal Reserve Act, also called the Glass-Owen Bill, was passed by the Senate on the evening of December 23, 1913 by a vote of 43 to 25, with 27 senators absent or abstaining. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law 1 hour later. The fate of the United States was sealed and delivered into the hands of the European banking aristocracies. The Federal Reserve is neither federal nor does it have enough gold to back up what it lends. The Federal Reserve is a cartel of banking families, dominantly European, and lends on paper only money to the United States and forces citizens of the U.S. to pay the interest with their tax dollars. Barry Goldwater, the late senator from Arizona who ran against Lyndon Johnson in 1964 for president, said most Americans have no real understanding of the operation of international moneylenders. The bankers want it that way. We recognize in a hazy sort of way that the Rothschilds and the Warburgs of Europe and the houses of J.P. Morgan, Kuhn Loeb and Company, Schiff, Lehman, and Rockefeller possess and control vast wealth. How they acquired this vast financial power and employ it is a mystery to most of us. International bankers make money by extending credit to governments. The greater the debt of the political state, the larger the interest returned to the lenders. The national banks of Europe are actually owned and controlled by private interests. The federal government of the United States does not own any portion of the Federal Reserve, nor can common citizens own stakes in this cartel. The Federal Reserve does not publish audited accounts, but is paid over $150 billion a year by the American taxpayers. This central bank regularly creates periods of inflation or deflation in a scientific method that creates enormous profits for these banking families at the expense of over 99% of the population. Today, Chase Bank, J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller owned, and Citibank, Rockefeller owned, have the majority control of shares of the Federal Reserve. In concert with the Rockefellers, the Habsburg elite, which included the soon-to-be-named Windsors, premeditated a world war to consolidate their power. The Ludlow massacre was an early indication of the length to which the Rockefellers would go to achieve their goals. Rockefeller lusted after the Russian Baku oil fields. However, Tsar Nicholas, on Rasputin's advice, was not willing to involve Russia with the Rockefellers. Rasputin also counseled the Tsar against going to war with Germany, which was also Habsburg-controlled, and for this attempts were made on Rasputin's life. Kaiser Wilhelm, the last Emperor of Germany and King of Prussia, was first cousin to King George V of the British-German Saxe-Coburg-Gotha family in Britain, soon to be renamed as the Windsors. Wilhelm's mother was Queen Victoria's daughter. Kaiser Wilhelm's personal banker was Max Warburg, who had helped manipulate the Federal Reserve into being. Wilhelm's leading advisor was Otto von Bismarck, who was the leading German Freemason. The point of the war from this German and British-German leadership, the Saxe-Coburg-Gotha-Warburg-Del Banco family, was to centralize control of Europe and run the continent from their central banking sites in London. The cabal already financially controlled Great Britain and recently gained large control of the United States through the Federal Reserve Act. Now they sought to reorganize Europe in a strategy towards globalization in the 20th century. The Habsburg-Rockefeller cabal plotted to set up a group to be known as the Council on Foreign Relations, through which they could orchestrate internal commissions within a new organization, the League of Nations, and set its agenda. In this fashion, the Habsburg-Rockefeller cabal could, with near invisibility, originate binding treaties between nations leading to their increased control of a host of countries around the world. The cabal was completely willing to commit mass murder and genocide in order to achieve this end. Archduke Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was the initial victim, assassinated by a Serbian Freemason agent working for Habsburg interests in order to create an excuse for Germany to wage war. Over in the U.S. during his reign, Woodrow Wilson promised that he would not allow America to become involved in a European war, but the J.P. Morgan Pasteur interests who brought Wilson to power, in concert with one Colonel House and the British statesman Winston Churchill, succeeded in involving America in 1917. The device?
The sinking of the Lusitania in 1916 purposefully sank in order to generate a public backlash which would pull the United States into war with Germany. Evidently, modern scholars like Colin Thompson have shown that Woodrow Wilson knew 4 days beforehand that the Lusitania was carrying 6 million rounds of ammunition plus explosives. Lord Mersey, who headed a British Board of Inquiry, would later remark that the Lusitania case was dirty business. While Lord Mersey blamed the Lusitania's captain, as His Majesty's government had instructed him to do, he resigned, rejected his fee, and from that date on refused to handle British government commissions, indicating his disgust with Britain's highest authorities. This conspiratorial elite should have been brought to trial for treason, but that would presume the system for the elite cabal is based on justice. Millions would die in World War I. 500,000 men died in the trenches in northern France in horrible, bloody battles in which poison gases were used. Both David Icke and William Bramley write convincingly that the massive bloodletting was abetted through an alliance between these secret cabals of the elite and a confederation of extraterrestrials which feed off of death, war, and blood sacrifice. As well, these scholars offer evidence and theories that these malevolent ETs may exist both in our space and time, as well as in another type of space referred to in esoteric literature as the lower astral. In addition, the human race appears to be a slave labor force of an extraterrestrial civilization. Furthermore, a relationship may exist between these malevolent ETs and the type of cigar-shaped UFOs seen across America, most notably in Texas between 1896 and 1897, just 20 years prior to the United States entry into World War I. By May 1, 1918, the Bolsheviks controlled only a very small portion of Russia and were dangerously close to being eliminated until a committee created by Wall Street oil, weapons, banks, and transportation sectors helped finance and support the Bolsheviks. The Communist Party USA had nothing to do with this organization. It was created by corporate elements to finance one side of a foreign war without the constitutional right or directive to wage war in another country. The American League to Aid and Cooperate with Russia, officially organized in public in Washington, D.C., was led by George P. Whalen of Vacuum Oil Company as treasurer, Coffin and Odin of General Electric, Thompson of the Federal Reserve System, and Willard of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. This group of international bankers backed the Bolshevik Revolution and subsequently profited from the establishment of a Soviet Russia. The very people who engineered World War I on all sides were appointed to attend the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. The host of this conference was Baron Edmund de Rothschild, a leading campaigner for a Jewish state in Palestine where the cabal could profit off of perpetual conflict for decades to come. In addition, Rockefeller Jr. provided the funding for the construction of the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem, the Rockefeller Museum, which quarantines the Dead Sea Scrolls. Out of the Paris Peace Conference came the World Court in The Hague, Netherlands, and the League of Nations, formed on June 28, 1919, an organization secretly intended to further the cabal's goal of a one-world global government. It was determined that the League should convene at the Palace of Versailles, known also as the Palace of the Sun King, symbolically very meaningful to the banking cabal. In the 1920s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated a substantial amount towards the restoration of the Palace of Versailles. Rockefeller Jr. endowed a major library for the League in Geneva in order to rewrite history as he and the cabal saw fit. Rockefeller Jr. also financially supported many of the programs of the League of Nations, all the while focusing on a brain trust for the cabal to be known as the Council on Foreign Relations, which he officially announced later in 1921 in New York City. The CFR, with major bases in New York City and Washington, D.C., describes its mission as promoting understanding of foreign policy and America's role in the world. In reality, The CFR employs politicians, legal experts, military and intelligence chieftains, and the lords of banking for one reason: to advance the elite banking family's agenda. The CFR's first incarnation attended the Paris Peace Conference, and on May 30th, 1919, at the Hotel Majestic, this group of British and American banking cabal representatives, which included pre-CFR constructionists and their British counterparts, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, RIIA, formerly known as the Chatham House, began their unholy alliance. Remember the name Hotel Majestic, because it would take on more significance in the late 1940s. Members at this first meeting included Colonel Edward House, Paul Warburg, and Herbert Hoover, among others. John W. Davis, the personal attorney for J.P. Morgan, would become CFR's founding president. Paul Warburg would remain a highly influential member of CFR until his death. Carroll Quigley, professor of international relations at Georgetown University, published Tragedy and Hope in 1966, illustrating the real goals of the CFR. The powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The CFR-RIIA puppet organization, the League of Nations, stated its goals to be disarmament, preventing war, settling disputes, and improving global welfare, all of which were terrible failures as demonstrated by events that concluded in a Second World War. The League not only proved incapable of preventing aggression by the Axis powers in the 1930s, but was led by the cabal who financed the Axis and enriched themselves through its financial commissions. The League of Nations had a council of 4 permanent members: Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, and 4 inconsequential, non-permanent members were elected every year by the Assembly in a token show of power sharing. However, by 1933, both Japan and Germany had quit the council meetings. The USSR was added in 1934, only to be expelled in 1939, 2 years after the Italians withdrew in 1937. Great Britain, who had colonized the globe by force over the centuries, did not seem very adept at keeping good neighbors. This had everything to do with the banking families attempting to wrestle control of governments away from the leaders of countries it tried to dominate, and these leaders took a severe dislike to the financial tentacles of the Warburgs, Passeurs, Rockefellers, and Rothschilds. Over the years, a number of Rockefeller's sons would join the CFR. David Rockefeller became its youngest director in 1949. A plan was formed by the banking syndicates and CFR and negotiated through vehicles like the League of Nations. The Dawes and Young plans for German reparations were formulated by the Wall Street war machine and proposed through diplomats. These reparation loans generated huge windfall profits for the multinational bankers. The negotiators and profit takers for the US and German sides were the same people who helped Hitler and the Nazis rise to power in post-World War I Germany. In 1926, Albert Vogler became the head of Germany's largest steelworks, Vergnügt Stahlwerk, and as early as 1928 he began to fund the Nazi Party. He joined with other industrialists in signing the letter that successfully urged Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Adolf Hitler as Chancellor. Scholar Anthony Sutton makes it clear: after profiting handsomely from the German hyperinflationary distress of 1923 and planning to place the German reparations burden onto the backs of American investors, Wall Street found it had brought about the 1929 financial crisis. Meanwhile, Henry Ford made plans and implemented the construction of a massive factory in Cologne, which began building trucks that would later enable the Third Reich to invade France, Eastern Europe, and Russia. In 1931, Ford deferred many management duties in America to ex-boxer Harry Bennett, who enforced his will as Ford's fist with hired strongmen and ex-convicts. Hitler and Himmler modeled their Gestapo on Ford and Bennett, who had links to the Detroit. The May 26, 1937 Battle of the Overpass by Bennett's thugs against the workers wanting to unionize was a prime example of Ford philosophy in action. On February 20th, 1933, Albert Vogler of Steelworks Vernicht Stahlwerk attended the meeting with Adolf Hitler, Hermann Goering, and Hildmar Schacht of the German Ministry of Economics, where the Association of German Industrialists raised 3 million marks for the Nazi Party in the forthcoming election. Schacht had also been a negotiator for the reparations loans, as was Owen Young of General Electric. 3 Wall Street houses, Dillon Reed, Harris Forbes, and National City Company, handled 3/4 of the reparations loans used to create the German cartel system, including the Dominique Vernicht Stahlwerk run by Vogler and I.G. Farben, which together produced 95% of the explosives for the Nazi side in World War II. Hitler imitated and preached Ford's hatred of the Jewish people to the Germans. In Hitler's Mein Kampf on page 639, Hitler propagandized against Jewish people. Ford's factory in Cologne turned out tractor trailers with the help of slave labor and parts delivered from Detroit, and the occupied Ford factory in France sent 1,000 tractor trailers for transporting troops, German, not French, every month. It was a crime that Henry Ford was never tried for treason to the United States, where millions of Jewish people live and have given their lives to creating good works in the United States, and not instigated wars, especially wars in which not hundreds, not thousands, but millions died. Henry Ford, Jew-hater and Hitler admirer, true to his fascist leanings, made his Cologne factory assist in the Nazi armament. For Hitler and the Nazis, the factory in Cologne was so valuable to the Nazis that Hitler awarded Ford his highest honor in 1938. Just after Hitler created the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, he awarded the first 2 Grand Crosses of the German Eagle to Italian dictator Benito Mussolini and his son-in-law Count Ciano. Ford was soon to follow. Here Karl Kapp, German Consul General of Cleveland, and Fritz Hayler, German Consul of Detroit, present Henry Ford with the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. It bears repeating that Rockefeller and Ford had a very close alliance since at least the late 1890s. The Nazis' final solution to exterminate the Jews was nothing but a grand economic solution, according to William Bramley, who wrote The Gods of Eden. The concentration camps were designed and used as slave labor camps. This unpaid slave labor created huge profits for both the German economy and the American corporations. These companies that funded the Nazis were rewarded with more windfall profits due to the cheapest labor method in all the world: work enslaved human beings without pay and slowly starve them to death. That's what it was really all about, getting ahead of all competition through slavery. The American corporations have spent years trying to cover it up by controlling media empires through corporate advertising contributions or outright ownership. This history does not make its way into the history books that you or your children read when attending high school history class, and only rarely at the university level. The Nazi intent was to kill off non-Aryans. Here is a research thread that can be picked up in the UFO Hypotheses DVD Peggy Kane Volume 2 NASA Upside Down, in which Peggy Kane, Alex Collier, Bob Dean, Kathy O'Brien, and others engaged the UFO research world with testimonies suggesting a hypothesis that merits consideration regarding Hitler, the Aryans, the Habsburgs, the Rothschilds, and a custodial race of extraterrestrials, possibly reptilian in biological makeup. Standard Oil in New Jersey was controlled by Walter C. Teagle. Teagle, who died in 1962, was the longtime president and later chairman of the board of Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, which is now ExxonMobil Corporation, polluter of Alaska's shoreline. Teagle was number 1 on the Standard Oil hierarchy, below only John D. Rockefeller Sr. and Jr. Teagle was the president of the largest oil corporation in America and often attended President Franklin Roosevelt at Roosevelt's Warm Springs Foundation. If Teagle didn't have Roosevelt's ear, that would have been news. Teagle had graduated from Cornell University in 18. Teagle was a longtime Cornell trustee from 1924 to 1954 and made large contributions to that institution. But Teagle had another cause which he supported with far more money and fervor than Cornell.
Tegel sponsored the Nazis with many millions and millions of dollars through Standard Oil, which alerted one U.S. ambassador who apparently was not on the take. Ambassador William Dodd wondered what business an American corporation would be up to by contributing so much to the military buildup of the Nazi Party in Germany, even at the same time backing Roosevelt's New Deal in 1932 and 1933. Had the Nazis won the Second World War, realized the leaders of the Standard Oil Syndicate, they would become the most powerful corporate leadership of both North America and Europe, the uncontested kings of the world. There was a lot riding on the outcome of World War II through the eyes of limitless greed. Ambassador Dodd in Germany was struck by the monetary and technical contributions by the Rockefeller-controlled Vacuum Oil Company in building up military gasoline facilities for the Nazis. So Ambassador Dodd in Germany warned President Franklin Roosevelt to the danger, but Dodd's warning fell on deaf ears. Dodd believed for some reason that Roosevelt would intervene, but Roosevelt was allied to and backed by these same oil interests who were funding the Nazis and the Bolsheviks. That was Rockefeller, who had his eyes on the Russian Baku oil fields, Tegel, and their syndicate of industrialists, bankers, and allies within the military. James Warburg, the son of Paul Warburg, was a financial advisor to Franklin D. Roosevelt in the first years of his presidency. As well, Patsy Hofstengel, another Roosevelt friend, was also a participant in the Reichstag fire, an engineered German crisis not unlike America's 9/11 or Britain's gunpowder plot that helped turn the German people towards Nazi control. I.G. Farben contributed 400,000 Reichmarks directly to Schacht and Hess for use in the crucial 1933 elections, and Farben was subsequently in the forefront of military development in Nazi Germany. The money men who played a direct central role in I.G. Farben and Hitler's coup d'etat were Walter Tegel, representing John D. Rockefeller Sr., banker Paul Warburg, whose brother Max Warburg was on the board of I.G. Farben in Germany, and Edsel Ford. The financing for Hitler and his SS street thugs came in mostly from the Bank of England and these U.S. firms, including Henry Ford in 1922. Edsel Ford would continue the family tradition in 1942 by encouraging French Ford to profit from arming the German Wehrmacht, and later these Ford vehicles were used by Germany against American soldiers as they landed in France in 1944. Many U.S. multinational corporations made millions from Hitler's military construction program all the way up through 1942. Among the U.S. corporations which were financing the Nazis were J.P. Morgan, T.W. Lamont, the Rockefellers, Standard Oil, National City Bank, Chase and Manhattan Banks, Kuhn Loeb and Company, Union Banking Company, led by George Herbert Walker, George Bush Sr.'s grandfather, and Prescott Bush, who was one of only 7 shareholders in UBC, a New York bank for the leading Nazi banker and supporter Fritz Thyssen. Brown Brothers Harriman, led by Averell Harriman, the railroad tycoon, and Prescott Bush, father of George Bush Sr. and grandfather to George Bush Jr. Brown Brothers Harriman and Company was created through the 1931 merger of Brown Brothers and Company, a century-plus-old Philadelphia merchant bank, with Harriman Brothers and Company, recently established in New York City in 1927, and A. Harriman and Company. Among its initial partners was Prescott S. Bush, later a senator from Connecticut. Brown Brothers Harriman and Company was one of Fritz Thyssen's Wall Street connections. Thyssen was an ardent financial backer of the Nazi Party until 1938. Thyssen later confessed to his financings in a book called I Paid Hitler. For Thyssen's interests, Brown Brothers Harriman had bought and shipped millions of dollars of gold, steel, fuel, coal, and U.S. Treasury bonds to Germany, used to build the Nazis' war machine. Brown Brothers Harriman dealings were sanctioned by Roosevelt's U.S. Treasury Department, which insisted that so-called trusts handle all German business in the United States. Union Banking Company worked in concert with the royal Dutch family, specifically Prince Bernhard, through Thyssen's Dutch banks.
Thyssen had control of many German banks as well as those in Holland, and Union Banking Company and Brown Brothers Harriman in the U.S. In this way, Thyssen could funnel money out of Germany, through Holland, and into the United States through Union Banking Company. When reserves at Thyssen's German banks needed replenishing, Prescott Bush laundered the Nazi money through Brown Brothers Harriman and sent it back to Thyssen's banks in Germany. Thyssen relocated to the United States in 1939 as he had planned years in advance, just as the Second World War was about to erupt. For his part, Prince Bernhard went on to help form the Bilderberg Group. In October 1942, the abuse had become so blatant that the U.S. government seized all the Nazi banking operations managed by Prescott Bush. Union Banking Corporation and Prescott Bush were charged with trading with the Enemy Act, and all their stocks were seized. Then the U.S. seized two Harriman companies led by Bush, Holland America Trading Corporation and Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation. Then in November 1942, yet another Walker Bush Corporation was seized, Silesian American Corporation. It was official. The Bush family had assisted the Nazis in financing and making the steel to kill Allied soldiers. This was treason. Approximately one-third of the German war machine was financed by Thyssen through the Bush family. Incidentally, when Thyssen died in 1951, the assets were unfrozen and Prescott Bush, soon to be a Connecticut senator, was given $1.5 million. Chase Manhattan Bank received 31% of the Thyssen fortune at this time. The Rockefellers were in it up to the top of their heads. Today, the Thyssen Group is the wealthiest industrial in Germany. The Bush family has gone on to create financial alliances with the bin Laden family of Saudi Arabia through the Carlyle Group. One wonders when these engineered wars and atrocities will stop. As well, in 1933, General Electric made payments to strengthen the Nazi Party, which helped put the uniforms on Himmler and his SS street thugs. A donation of 60,000 Reichmarks was made to Hitler by German General Electric, AEG, which had 4 directors and a 25 to 30% interest held by the U.S. General Electric parent company. Gerard Swope, an originator of Roosevelt's National Recovery Administration, Owen Young of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and Clark Miner of International General Electric were dominantly in control of German General Electric. Almost all the directors of German General Electric were Hitler backers. GE was also cooperating with the Nazis, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Hornbach, and Krupp Steel Works. GE actually restricted U.S. development of tungsten carbide to the detriment of the U.S. in World War II. Somehow, the German General Electric plants managed to avoid being bombed the entire war by the Allies. Apparently Churchill, Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower and the combined military of the Allies just overlooked them, accidentally, inadvertently, and they would have us think we were not patriots to even consider otherwise. General Electric now owns NBC, MSNBC, CNBC, and a multitude of media networks throughout the world. Coincidentally, they aren't broadcasting this information either. In 1934, Irene DuPont of the DuPont family, William S. Knudsen, president of General Motors, and other banks from the DuPonts, the J.P. Morgan Bank, and General Motors financed a coup d'etat to install a fascist dictatorship in the United States. General Smedley Darlington Butler was approached by the plotters to lead the new military government, but instead blew the whistle on this Wall Street conspiracy to Roosevelt. The story was leaked to the press, which led a number of the conspirators to leave the country while the heat was turned up. According to Jules Archer, the fascist takeover of the United States was to be maintained under a dictator on behalf of America's bankers and industrialists. Congress merely conducted a token investigation and 4 years later published a report that was restricted to only a few eyes, but the report did acknowledge that certain persons did make an attempt to form a fascist organization. General Motors journal Opel, on American executives' orders, produced the Opel Blitz troop transports as well as parts for the Luftwaffe Ju-88 bombers. Americans bombed the General Motors Brandenburg factory in 1944, but after the war, U.S. taxpayers were forced to pay over $32 million as damages to General Motors. GM Vice President in charge of European operations James D. Moody received Hitler's Order of Merit of the Eagle in 1938 for his ardent work for the Nazi war machine. German General von Schell commented in 1941 that without the GM Opel factory, the Germans would have been unable to wage war in Europe. Other payments to the Nazi Party were made by the German electrical firm Siemens. Texas Oil Company, Texaco, was involved in Nazi endeavors through the German attorney Westrick. ITT made a fortune off the Nazi war machine through Baron Kurt von Schroeder's banking group. ITT also held a 28% interest in Focke-Wulf Aircraft, which manufactured the German fighter planes. Nazi armament minister Albert Speer and his Gestapo staff employed IBM machines to quickly and smoothly establish who were Jews, half-Jews, Union members, and card-carrying communists through deals with IBM's Thomas J. Watson, and rounded up over 1 million individuals for torture, execution, or slave labor with the help of IBM technology. In 1940, in an attempt to improve his reputation, Watson gave back the Order of Merit of the Eagle that he received a few years earlier from Dr. Helmar Schacht, president of the German Reichsbank, but Watson still continued doing business in Germany. In a 1943 report by Harold J. Carter for the Department of Justice, an unnamed IBM employee in Europe stated that IBM was an international monster and in a class with Nazis. The corporate leaders didn't mind what their financing was for as long as they received their profits. Obviously, any such exercise of unconstrained and superlegal power is unconstitutional, even though wrapped in the fabric of law-abiding actions, says author Anthony Sutton. Payments were made up to 1944 by Standard Oil of New Jersey to Heinrich Himmler's SS to develop synthetic gasoline for war purposes on behalf of the Nazis. Kurt von Schroeder was Standard Oil's key intermediary in the funding of the SS and technical aid to the Luftwaffe. Quoting from Anthony Sutton's book Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Standard Oil's role was technical aid to Nazi development of synthetic rubber and gasoline through a U.S. research company under the management control of Standard Oil. The Ethyl Gasoline Company, jointly owned by Standard Oil of New Jersey and General Motors, was instrumental in supplying vital ethyl lead to Nazi Germany over the written protests of the U.S. War Department, with the clear knowledge that the ethyl lead was for Nazi military purposes. Standard Oil allowed the German Air Force to buy lots of tetraethyl lead to boost the fuel for the fighters and bombers. The German bombs that fell on London came thanks to Standard Oil. The Luftwaffe could not have even flown their planes without the fuel additives supplied by Standard Oil, who, together with DuPont, held the patents. The cast of international bankers who led IG Farben and the multinational banks who financed the Nazis included Max Warburg, IG Farben director and Warburg banker, affiliated with the Bank of England. Paul Warburg, IG Farben director, co-creator of the Federal Reserve until his death in early 1932. H. A. Metz of IG Farben, also of Bank of Manhattan, a Warburg bank, later folded into Chase Bank, managed by the Rockefellers. C. E. Mitchell, director of American IG Farben, also director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and of National City Bank. And Hermann Schmitz, president of IG Farben Germany, on board of Deutsche Bank and the Bank of International Settlements. He received a minimal 10-year sentence at the Nuremberg trials. Georgetown professor Carroll Quigley, in his 1966 book Tragedy and Hope, showed that the Bank of England and its leading director, Montague Norman, was maintaining a neutral or favorable attitude towards Nazism. According to the Warmongers, a 1979 book by Howard Katz, a small article appeared in a Chicago newspaper on November 2, 1938. In the spring of 1934, a select financiers gathered around Montague Norman in the windowless building of the Bank of England in Threadneedle Street. Mr. Norman advised his directors to include Hitler in their plans. There was no opposition, and it was decided that Hitler should get covert help from London's financial section until Mr. Norman had succeeded in putting sufficient pressure on the government to make it abandon its pro-French policy for a more promising pro-German orientation. In 1938 and 1939, even just weeks before attacks and the Nazi bombing raids on London began, Rockefeller, Walter C. Teagle, and Standard Oil, through their British subsidiaries, sold at least 35 million tetraethyl lead to Germany. As well, Standard Oil collaborated on patents for synthetic rubber with IG Farben, the producer of concentration camp gas Zyklon B that killed millions of Jewish human beings. Teagle was not tried in Nuremberg, to the shame of all involved. Even after Hitler had invaded Czechoslovakia, Montague Norman and the Bank of England gave Nazi Germany 6 million pounds of Czech gold reserves held by the Bank of England. Once World War II began, the Bank of England gave loans to Britain to fight the Nazis, whom they had just financed. In the United States in 1940, the Securities and Exchange Commission must have smelled a rat, because it authorized the first and only true study of America's largest corporations, called the Distribution of Ownership in the 200 Largest Non-Financial Corporations. The SEC study concluded that while the Rockefellers held less than 20% of outstanding stocks of the top 200 largest corporations, that when compared to the remaining widely diverse ownership, the shares held by the Rockefellers were sufficient to give the Rockefeller family control over the corporations. By 1941, the U.S. government had given Ford $200 million to build the Willow Run bomber factory. Ford boasted that he would soon be producing a bomber every hour. Instead, the factory produced a total of 8,000 planes during the entire war, which satisfied both Hitler and Ford, whose factories in Germany and France would have been destroyed by the bombers. Joseph Borken's book, The Crime and Punishment of IG Farben, shows how IG Farben and the Nazi SS ran both the concentration camps and the adjacent factories, like at Auschwitz, as a business enterprise. They even extracted gold fillings from the teeth of their victims, used the hair for blankets and human skin for lampshades. These atrocities that were sponsored by these individual and corporate U.S. interests reduced human beings to livestock, which one would think only an alien to human mentality could do, especially on a scale this large. This cartel of companies, by virtue of their economic scale, have up until now been allowed to get away with these crimes against humanity without prosecution and divestiture. How could they get away with these horrendous crimes, wide open for the world to see, with never having been charged and held accountable even up until now? How could that happen unless they actually controlled the leadership, the government, and the military of the United States and Great Britain? And what would these corporate kings do to those who stood in their way? On September 22, 1947, Judge Charles Clark commented, "Standard Oil can be considered an enemy national in view of its relationship with IG Farben after the United States and Germany had become active enemies. This pattern of financing and creating war was the exact same method in which 18th century German princes had made fortunes by renting mercenaries to foreign nations, while Habsburg and Rothschild banks loaned money to all sides for waging war. The kings of banking and industry followed the malevolent philosophy of Machiavelli as if it were their Bible. Anthony Sutton summarizes well the evidence before us. The United States has, in spite of the Constitution and its supposed constraints, become a quasi-totalitarian state. While we do not yet have the overt trappings of dictatorship, the concentration camps and the knock at the door at midnight, we most certainly do have threats and actions aimed at the survival of non-establishment critics, use of the Internal Revenue Service to bring dissidents in line, and manipulation of the Constitution by a court system that is politically subservient to the establishment. There can be no full understanding and appreciation of 20th century American politics and foreign policy without the realization that this financial elite effectively monopolizes Washington policy. Through relationships to the Federal Reserve and the banking syndicate that gave birth to it, the Rockefeller Standard Oil Cartel controlled the top 200 non-financial corporations in the United States, according to the SEC report from 1940. Over several decades, this economic tyranny translated directly into political muscle, which gained nearly absolute control over the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and the population of the United States. This unprecedented power was now ready to be used to consolidate control of Europe by instigating a Second World War. What was the world climate like when you entered?
The world fever was building, and we were starting to build up our armies. We were accepting a lot more recruits than normal.
But there was a pretty strong isolationist sentiment in the country at that time.
Yeah, but not with the military. The military was anxious to recruit more people because when you add more people on the bottom, everybody above them gets promoted, you know. So they're always looking for expanding the base.
What's not discussed in a lot of the history books is how the corporations like I.G. Farben and Douglas and a number of the banks were playing both sides of the fence, funding
Henry
both
Ford
the
was building
Nazis,
parks
the
for
Japanese, and the Americans, and the British, funding both the Axis and the Allies, and making billions of dollars with the death and destruction of countries and massive numbers of civilians.
At the same time, Henry Ford was building Liberator bombers on more than one assembly line, production lines. He was also furnishing technology to the Germans, the German aerotechnical industry. All through the war, he sold them technology.
Among the corporations that would emerge from World War II much wealthier were the Standard Oil companies, which included Exxon, Esso, and Mobil Oil corporations, banking corporations like J.P. Morgan, Chase, Manhattan, and National City, investment houses like Jacob Schiff and Company, Fritz Thyssen and Gustav Krupp, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Dillon Reed, Harris Forbes, Brown Brothers Harriman, and Union Banking Corporation. Other war profiteers included Ford Motors, General Motors, IBM, Douglas Aircraft, Texaco, Siemens, IT&T, General Electric, and DuPont, and most all of the foreign companies controlled subsidiary corporations as well.
I think that the oil interests were behind a lot of our national policy decisions at that time, and still are. We're certainly going to burn a lot of oil in a war, and they're the marketeers. Big oil probably controls our government. If it involves 1/5 of the world's wealth, it's pretty big. And if the world is going to go bankrupt if we stop suddenly, that's serious business.
I repeat again that I stand on the platform of our party. We will not participate in foreign wars, and we will not send our army naval or air forces to fight in foreign lands outside of the Americas except in case of attack.
These mega millionaires without a conscience that led corporate America and America's political machine were bent on sacrificing more American lives. Their scheme was to provoke the Japanese into a war against America. The bait? The Navy's aging fleet gathered together at Pearl Harbor.
I wanted to be a pilot. That's what I tried to get in the Army for when I graduated from high school. I didn't have the 2-year college requirement and a couple other things to be an aviation cadet, but a recruiter sergeant talked me into getting in the service and applying from inside the service, saying you can get waivers from your commanders to make up for any deficiencies.
It did work, so you did end up getting some college experience as well?
No, I didn't get the college experience. They assigned me to a tank battalion as a tank mechanic, and I went through a tank repairman school.
That's not exactly what you...
No, that's not what I started out to do. And I was up in the Barstow Desert there in California, and I was thinking, this is too hot. I don't like these noisy things, and I wanted to be in an airplane. So I applied for transfer to flight line as a flight mechanic, and they sent me to a mechanic school over at Keesler Air Force Base. 6 months, I think it was.
And what city was that in?
San Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio.
And I graduated from that and was assigned on the flight line and worked long enough to rise to staff sergeant's grade. I was a flight chief by the time my commander, that squadron commander at that time, kind of took pity on me. I was doing everything that I thought they wanted done to get their attention. I volunteered for extra duty and things like that, policing the yard. And so I went through flight mechanic school, and I was running up I was a crew chief on the P-38 and running it up every morning, and I just wanted to let it jump the chocks and take off. And my commander knew how anxious I was to actually fly one. And he found, and he started doing some personal research, and he found that there was still an old regulation on the books from World War I when they trained sergeant pilots. And they didn't require a 2-year college education. So he took my pilot's training application and converted it to the Flying Sergeant's program, got it approved, and I got an appointment to the flight school as a flying sergeant.
That must have been a really exciting day for you.
Yeah, I was the only flying sergeant in the class. Everybody else was aviation cadets, and I was a aviation cadet sergeant. Because I had already been in the service, they made me a cadet officer right away. So I graduated as a second lieutenant anyway, from the sergeant program. And then because I was mechanically inclined, was already a flight mechanic on the flight line, as I was graduating, a telegram went up on the board that they were going to open a new Army Air Force flight test training program to train test pilots for the expanding service. Mm-hmm. And you had to have certain qualifications. You had to have an engineering background and things like that. That I didn't have an engineering degree or anything, but they accepted my flight training or mechanics service on a line as a suitable substitute, I suppose, because I got appointed to the pilot training program, first pilot training program that government ran, the Air Force ran, Army Air Force. And I went through the first flight school. At that point, I flew all the aircraft that we had in the inventory, which was about 20 or 25 different kinds. And we were also, I flew a number of Navy aircraft that we had borrowed from the Navy to round out the program, because they had different performance characteristics.
And was this still all in San Antonio?
So, yes, still going on in the first flight test pilot school was in San Antonio also, so I just went I graduated from the cadets and advanced and went right over to the flight test pilot school and graduated from that as a flight test officer.
By the early 1940s, the entire industrialized world had manufactured millions upon millions of cars and airplanes with combustion engines,
all dependent on petroleum, just as Rockefeller, Ford, and Edison had designed. An industrialized nation suddenly left without enough petroleum would go into an economic shock. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt, once Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy under then-President Woodrow Wilson, always retained a very close relationship to the Navy. Roosevelt understood that the United States had an aging fleet of World War I battleships on hand that were slower and weaker than other modern navies like the Japanese had assembled throughout the 1930s. When a second engineered world war erupted in Europe as Nazi Germany invaded Poland and the British declared war on Germany, the American public wanted no part of the war. The populist American public maintained strong, isolationist, non-interventionist views. But President Franklin Roosevelt represented Rockefeller interests and naval, corporate, and Freemasonry interests. So Roosevelt employed a practice very common to Standard Oil. He ordered that petroleum supplies be cut off to Japan, which would throw Japan into an economic shock and thereby provoke Japan to retaliate with a military first strike against the United States. Roosevelt and his naval strategists realized that Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, then still only a territory of the U.S., was the obvious target of a Japanese strike. Through the dedicated research of Robert B. Stinnett, author of Day of Deceit, and Mark Emerson Willey, author of Pearl Harbor, Mother of All Conspiracies, and through the recent release of Freedom of Information Act documents, the evidence clearly shows that the U.S. military intelligence had broken secret Japanese codes and decrypted intercepted secret Japanese radio transmissions, clearly showing many days before December 7th that the Japanese were planning to attack Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt and his advisors chose to purposely withhold the intercepted intelligence from key U.S. military leaders in the Pacific who would later be scapegoated. Roosevelt chose to sacrifice Short and the lives of American military men on the USS Arizona and the many other ships stationed in Pearl Harbor in order to jolt the isolationist public with a shock that would traumatize the American public into joining the French and British in a Second World War.
The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us.
I was in basic training out in California, near San Pedro, I think it was. And I had gotten a weekend pass and gone into a little town nearby to a restaurant for dinner. And I went to a movie, and Pearl Harbor was struck while I was in the movie. It was already daylight there, and or just approaching daylight when Pearl Harbor was attacked. I got back to my air base, and they said, "Where's your uniform?" I said, "I was had gone to a movie." They said, "Well, where's your pass?" I showed them my pass to go to town, and they wanted more ID, and they took me to a guardhouse where they searched me and checked with my squadron to verify that I belonged there. And I said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, Pearl Harbor was just bombed, and we're in war. We're at war." That was my first inkling of it, and so we weren't immediately in a war, but we started building up rapidly to engage. And even at the time, I wondered, with my young mind, I was only 17 at the time, and I wondered why our whole fleet was in Pearl Harbor in one place at one time if we suspected the Japanese were coming. It didn't make any sense. And then in later years, I discovered that our new capital aircraft carriers, 3 of them, were at sea, but all the old battleships that were old ships from World War I were in Pearl Harbor and sunk. And that never made good sense to me. And today I'm convinced that Roosevelt and Admiral Kimmel both knew the Japanese were coming, They knew where they were all the time. They knew that they were planning on attacking Pearl Harbor, and they were going to let them do it. And they brought all the old capital ships into Pearl Harbor, anchored them in the facility there inside of the harbor, where they could easily be attacked and sunk for a specific reason. I believe that Roosevelt and Admiral Kimmel were calculating that we couldn't win a naval battle with the old World War I ships, the Japanese having new ships. We would have to have newer ships than the Japanese to win in any conflict with them, and they were sacrificing the old fleet to get our public together to build a new fleet. They knew that we had the finances, the money, and the resources to do it. First of all, we had all of our old ships into Pearl Harbor. They were all south of Harbor on one pretext or another after we knew the Japanese fleet had sailed. And we sent the new carriers to sea. They were at sea. They weren't in the harbor there. We knew that the Japanese, over the years preceding this, several years preceding, had been building a new Pacific fleet. They had all new battleships, all new carriers. They had new destroyers. They had, and they were building wholesale. And they had a big fleet and all new equipment. Our Navy strategists knew we couldn't win any battles with them because our antiquated equipment didn't have the firepower, didn't have the speed, and didn't have a lot of things. And if we actually engaged in a conflict, the Japanese are going to best us. So we ordered all of our ships into Pearl Harbor after we knew the Japanese were on their way to attack, and let them sink them. We didn't tell the people in Pearl Harbor that they were coming, although Washington knew this 2 days before they got there. And they even knew the timetable. They knew when they were going to attack. They didn't tell anybody out there. And we lost most of our capital ships. But guess what happened? Just what the strategists thought. Roosevelt was one of them. They thought, we can't win a Pacific War with the fleet that we've got. We've got to have a new fleet. We can't build a new fleet in time. We can't get the American public to finance it unless we really get them behind us. So we'll sacrifice the old fleet. It's not going to do us any good anyway. Let the Japanese sink it, let them claim their victory, and then we'll marshal the public behind us and rebuild it, and then go back and attack, which is what we did. We built whole new fleets and went out there with more than the Japanese had, more and newer, and won the war.
And so they were willing to sacrifice all those servicemen and...
Absolutely. And so we took the black eye just so we could marshal the public, get the public behind us to win the war. I think, in my own mind, I think that our strategists are doing the same thing all over again with the Twin Towers. We tried the same thing with the Twin Towers. I think we gambled the Twin Towers for the same reason this time, but too much evidence is out there to show that we were complicit in the crime. I don't think that a bunch of ragtag Arabs got in there and hijacked 5 airplanes all in one morning and successfully carried off attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. We don't have positive proof that we allowed Pearl Harbor to happen, but I think the record would show, if they released all the records, that we were aware of it, that we decided to do nothing, let the Japanese attack, and even brought the ships into the harbor to lose them, knowing that we couldn't fight a winning battle with the old ships.
Mysterious luminous green orbs of considerable size began to appear across the planet during World War II. The orbs became known as Foo Fighters and ever increasingly appeared in the skies during ugly military air battles over Europe. Greenish glowing globes were sighted as early as September 1941 in the Indian Ocean by members of the British Navy. Pilots were buzzed above the Timor Sea near New Guinea in February 1942, and both the U.S. military and the people of Los Angeles were spooked by a Foo Fighter flyover on February 25, 1942, which made for alarming headlines. In August 1944, a B-29 crew between Sumatra and Ceylon encountered a brightly throbbing sphere, which paced the bomber and its crew for 8 minutes, even following along the B-29 precisely for a number of maneuvers and altitude changes. Glowing globes were observed by Canadian military outside Antwerp, Belgium in September 1944, and in December 1944, the New York Times reported that pilot Lieutenant Donald Myers claimed that he and his plane were chased and pursued for 20 miles down the Rhine River by Foo Fighters. During the daylight as American shock troops invaded Okinawa in May 1945, bright gold balls whizzed overhead in straight-line groups, tracked by a variety of Allied radars at over 600 miles per hour. The Foo Fighters would appear as varying numbers of glowing orbs, moving in intelligently controlled fashion at speeds beyond our capabilities, sometimes blinking out, often glowing with bright greens, reds, oranges, yellows, and whites. Some theorized that the Foo Fighters were Nazi-engineered aircraft which flew without leaving a footprint to radar. Plasma electrical discharges do not chase crews for 20 miles up the Rhine River. Could the orbs be something as exotic as science fiction-sounding concepts? Possibly emotional energy collectors, or anti-gravitation surveillance and tracking tools for someone other than Earth humans? Maybe aura and telepathic surveillance, or alien intelligence gathering or mapping missions. The possibilities are many. As governments learned more, the leaders from Earth's various societies would react differently. Neither the Axis nor the Allies have claimed to manufacture the orbs that intelligently maneuvered through the skies during World War II and occasionally pursued terrestrial aircraft. Wendell Stevens possesses the largest known collection of UFO photos in civilian hands in the world, and has spent a lifetime trading up for the best UFO photos. They are assembled in a collection Stevens calls UFO Photo Archives. Many UFO photos are available from Stevens, who is also a digital and print book publisher of over 30 years, specializing in the genre of in-depth, nonfiction UFO research. Regarding the Foo Fighters, Wendell has his own lines of thought.
Now, what's your recollection of Foo Fighters during your World War II period?
Well, you know, I never saw one. I heard reports of Foo Fighters, and they were nothing but balls of light that maneuvered around the aircraft in flight. And they were called Foo Fighters from the French word for fire is feu. And they were, in Europe, they were calling them Few Fighters, and we called them Foo Fighters. Just fireballs. They didn't seem to be anybody manufacturing. We didn't know where they were coming from, and there wasn't a lot of reports of them either. There was only a half a dozen reports during the whole war in the Pacific, where I was. There were more reports over Europe of activity, strange activity, and I think that the Germans did have some operational devices that they were using at times. I hadn't even paid much attention to the reports of Foo Fighters because there was never any solid evidence, never photographs of them. Well, there was a couple of photographs, there was nothing substantial, and nobody knew anything about them. They just appeared and disappeared.
Well, think about those pictures for a moment that came through, and were you looking at them by yourself, or did you see them with other people by your side, and did you discuss them?
I was seeing them in air technical intelligence summaries that reported on descriptions of fighter pilots of these Foo Fighter phenomena, and occasionally there would be a picture.
And so, did you have opportunity to discuss that information with anybody? Or what were your thoughts and analysis regarding
Only
that?
with fellow pilots, and I had never seen one, they hadn't seen one either, so all we were looking at was scattered reports by various pilots, military pilots, of a strange phenomena seen in the sky that they couldn't explain and couldn't account for.
The German industries were producing high-caliber science and technology in the mid to late 1930s. According to the video documentary UFO Secrets of the Third Reich, and also based on many of the items of evidence in Wendell Stevens' book, Nazi Flying Discs, two young German women, both psychic mediums, together made psychic contact with beings claiming to be extraterrestrials from planetary systems revolving around the star Aldebaran. In Munich, scientific specialists close to the women joined them in a small group comprised of leading minds from both Munich and the University of Vienna, and eventually began face-to-face contacts with the humans from Aldebaran, who appeared physically very similar to Earth humans. The Aldebaran visitors were allowed to enlighten the members of the secret Black Sun's inner circle, and these totalitarian sympathizers were seduced by the power of the Aldebaran aerospace technologies and wasted little time turning the Aldebaran program into a mostly militaristic direction. According to Stevens, when gun turrets were mounted on the underside of these Nazi flying saucers, the Aldebarans closed down the program and sabotaged the remaining craft because they could see that their German associates no longer had peaceful intentions in mind. Later, as Germany fell to the Allies and hidden underground Nazi saucer development bases were being discovered and pilfered by the victorious Allies, two American military programs, Project Overcast, which evolved into Project Paperclip, would later grab up many of the German scientists of their entire secret bases. Project Paperclip merged the scientists into a highly secret military and industrial operation in the United States, and would have the contents of their bases analyzed from top to bottom at Air Technical Intelligence Command in Ohio, later testing the captured discs at Sandia, Los Alamos, and White Sands in New Mexico. All this was done without reporting any of these facts to the general public, and through well-managed compartmentalization, only a few elite officials and military leaders had a full and complete picture of the Nazi and American saucer programs. The true nature and disposition of the Aldebarans is also highly suspect, as it seems sharing this superior technology with such a regressive leadership as the Nazis may have been as irresponsible as giving a bad-tempered 2-year-old a loaded submachine gun.
5 or 6 years later into the program, what's going on at that stage when World War II is just getting going?
Okay. By 1938, they had the first Haunebu flying. It had ascended from ground level to 60,000 feet in something like 4 minutes, which is faster than, it was a record setter, faster than any other airplane could ascend. It could, by now the Germans had learned that when it was weightless, it was everything was supported in a force field, and it's a force field acted on everything within the force field simultaneously, so it could make sharp angle turns with no inertial forces being felt aboard the craft. They also discovered early on that because of the force field, when they were trying to wash one time, the water wouldn't hit it, the metal wouldn't wet when it was under power. So they tried to test it in a big freshwater lake in Austria, and they took it into the lake and underwater and back out again, and it flew underwater just as handily and conveniently as it did in the air. And because the water didn't wet the surface, there was no drag, and it moved faster underwater than anything else we knew. So the Germans saw another opportunity, and they began to develop the craft for both air and underwater operations. And then when it was captured by, when the factory that was captured by the Russians discovered this, they moved them, the whole factory, lock, stock, and barrel, which was underground in Germany, to an underground facility in northern Siberia near Lake Taimyr, or the Taimyr Peninsula, where it was put back underground again, and they had a lot of water all around the peninsula there to experiment. I think now looking back that some of the reports that I handled in Alaska, a craft sitting on the Arctic Ocean when the B-29 approached and submerging and disappearing under the water could have been a Haunebu, because it had that capability. Another one was sitting on the water, took off and flew away when the B-29 approached. I thought those were technologies that were clearly beyond Earth technology, and they had to be extraterrestrial, but now I'm not so sure. I guess I told you before about the letter I got from a man in Poland who said his father's brother, uncle, worked in one of the Kugelblitz factories there, and that after when the factory was captured and carried away to Russia, he didn't go. He said that the Germans came back a year later and offered, took a report in the newspapers, published a report they were going to pay bonuses to all the old factory workers, and invited them to a factory picnic in the woods. And they put on a nice picnic, and they gathered them all at the end of the picnic for a group photograph with a public photographer, and when they got them all in a group, they started machine gunning them and throwing them into a pit there, and they killed every one. And the father's brother was glad that he was in the hospital for something, and he couldn't go to get his bonus. He was glad he didn't go to get it because nobody else got any money either. And the same guy told me that his brother found out later that the Germans actually had several Hanabu's operation. I think he said they had 9 operational or usable at the time of one of the carpet bombing raids, which I think was on Schweinfurt. We had 800 bombers in the air at one time on one night. Took hours for them to pass a given point. And the Germans launched 6 Hanabus against the carpet bombers, and they brought down 1/4 of the fleet bombers, and almost 3,000 crew members died that night, in one night, from the 6 Hanabus that were used. And when the losses were so great that all the crew members were isolated when they got back to their bases and separately debriefed to see what they could find out about it. And a number of them reported seeing black discs in the sky against the fireballs. And the only 2 weapons used by the Germans were a device called a Motorstoffel that simply is a beam, electromagnetic beam that interrupted the electrical circuits. And the second one was gasoline aerosols that were dropped ahead of the bomber fleet with the spraying gas, and when the bomber fleet flew into the gas cloud, it would explode and take 5 or 6 bombers with it, and that would take out another half a dozen bombers with them, because they were flying in such close formation that if the formation was disturbed at all, they ran into each other on the sides and backed into the ones behind. And our losses were horrific that night. But the interesting thing here is that the uncle said that all the Hanabus were removed from Germany within less than 10 days later. They were all gone and never came back. The tide of war was changing, and somebody took the Hanabus out. We don't know where they are. They didn't crash. We didn't capture them. We don't know what happened to them. But who can order a victory, potential victory, out of the hands of the Germans? Who could take that away from the staff planners there? Has to be somebody bigger than all the staff planners to order them out of Germany, and they didn't come back. They could have been used on the next carpet bombing raid again, and they didn't lose any of the Hanabus. And we lost 200 airplanes, bombers, in one night.
And your best sources for this information are?
The uncle, the father's brother that worked in the Kugelblitz factory in Warsaw.
And what are the names of those individuals? Are they still alive?
Oh, probably not now. They were older people in World War II. I was a kid in World War II. They were men, working men.
When did you first encounter this information?
Well, the Polish guy sent me a letter that his uncle, this is what his uncle told him.
And when was that about? When did you receive that letter?
Oh gosh, in the early 90s.
What prevented the Nazis from using that fleet in wartime?
I think whoever ordered them out of Germany and ordered the plants dismantled and taken out of Germany, frustrated. They controlled the course of the war. They allowed us to win the war when we might not have won it.
And who could that be?
I don't know.
Think about it for a second. Speculate.
World bankers.
Tell me a little bit about the world bankers and their influence on World War II.
The world bankers seem to control world politics for their own advantage all the time. And they create and stop wars as they need to, first of all, to establish a market for consumables, which they sell, because they control the money that flows. And it allows or stimulates invention and technical progress that they make money on. So I think that some place above normal government, recognizable government level, is another level of money interests that control the whole thing. and they decide who's going to win and who's going to lose. And they back both sides. They're making money on both sides all the time.
You've got the Manhattan Project going on over in New Mexico, but also there's a much more advanced atomic energy program going on in Germany at the same time. Tell me about the dichotomy there between what history tells us happened in terms of atomic energy development and what your research has uncovered.
Well, when I saw the pictures of the two German atomic bombs that were captured in the Harz Mountains east of Peenemünde, I had seen pictures of the Fat Boy and the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki afterwards. The one was a fat, slender bomb. And the pictures of the bombs in the Harz, taken from the Harz Mountains, looked just like the other pictures I had seen. The pictures I had seen before were mock-ups. These were pictures from the German facility, along with pictures of the developers, the two engineers that were guiding the development using Jewish slave labor. And they succeeded in getting these bombs assembled. They did their testing in German East Africa, their atomic testing.
Oil wildcatting has been many an entrepreneur's lottery of choice for amassing a quick fortune, and Silas Newton was an oil wildcatter. Born in Kentucky in 1887 into the lower class, Newton found his direction early and graduated with a degree in geology from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. His passion was golf, and he won the Virginia Amateur Championship 2 different years. Newton searched to find a design for the world's most successful oil detection system. Newton was worth millions, which at that time meant something, but his life changed forever when he saw a crashed UFO shown to him by a geology professor with a security clearance. The UFO was from a crash near Aztec, New Mexico. Silas Newton was a man of sophistication and lived in high-end hotels and rented business space in very identifiable buildings. But someone wanted to discredit Newton and filed false charges of espionage during World War II, of which the FBI found absolutely no evidence. This young charging oil tycoon had touched a nerve somewhere high up.
Newton was no small potatoes. He was a co-founder of the biggest golf course in the Washington area. His name is on a brass plaque as one of the founding members of the golf course. There was presidents' names on other plaques along with his. So he was well known in influential circles. He was also a multimillionaire. He was an oil wildcatter. He was successful in a number of wells. He had a pretty good reputation. He was a little bit flamboyant. He was outspoken. He wasn't given to lying, though. The stories he told usually had substance in fact.
The 1930s creation of the klystron tube at Stanford University by the Varian brothers was a catalyst for the British development of radar. Among the renowned experts in ultra-high frequency was the man who wrote the book on the subject, Dr. Robert Sarbacher. Sarbacher's thorough understanding of this cutting-edge science, which was lorded over by the military, made Sarbacher an in-demand government scientific advisor. Sarbacher and Leo Gebauer both may have had involvement with the British military in the development and refinement of radar, and both were indeed electronics geniuses, later experts on sophisticated use of ultra-high frequency engineering and magnetism.
It came out of radar. The British invented radar beams, radar frequencies, and then shortly after that they modified the radar to a magnetic aerial detection. And Gebauer was somehow involved with British scientists that were doing the adaptation from radar to magnetic aerial detection. And because of this, he was interested in figures working in magnetics, and he knew that Carl Hyland headed a magnetics department in the physics laboratories in the University of Colorado. So he cultivated a relationship with Dr. Hyland.
Dr. Carl A. Hyland worked out of the Colorado. His area of expertise was in magnetics, and Hyland was no doubt familiar with magnetometers for measuring relative values of magnetic intensity. Hyland is cited as an expert on measuring underground oil accumulation using magnetism.
A liaison developed between Gabar and Dr. Hyland, and they checked with other researchers in the magnetics field, a number of other ones, as a matter of fact. And Gabar somehow had met Silas Newton. He was an oil wildcatter, and he was successful. He was a multimillionaire, successful in the oil business. Newton was palling around with Gabar because Gabar was working on a oil deposit detector, and Gabar got into that, working in England on the radar, the development of radar in England. And the radar was to do one thing, but Gabar was, he didn't have a degree, he didn't have a doctorate, but he was one of these child prodigies on magnetism. And so he took the English radar and modified it to look for cavities in the ground instead. And he succeeded in finding shadows and learning to interpret them. He showed this to Newton, and Newton financed the development of a device to do this that could be calibrated. By now I'm going to cadet school. He wanted to be a pilot too. His name was Llewellyn. And my mother wrote to our state senator and said that he had qualified for cadet training. Evidently the same sergeant program. I told her about that when mine went through. She got him in the program, and he started cadet school 1 month behind me. And my mother wrote the senator when he's getting ready to go and said, I only have 2 boys, and they both want to be pilots, and one of them is finished the first primary training phase, ready to go to the second phase. The younger one's about to start the primary phase. Could you hold the oldest one back so the younger one can catch up, so they go to get through together? That senator had enough clout to talk to Washington, to get Washington to hold me back for a class till my brother caught up to me, and then we went through together.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Graduated together.
And so then what happened after you graduated together? Where did
Well, I went to the fighter advanced training, and he went to bomber advanced training, and out of fighter advanced training I got to flight test school, and he went right into the bomber command, and by then the war had started, and we were sending support to Europe, and he went over on one of the early deployments and was flying B-24s over Germany.
What did he relate to you, his experiences were like?
Well, he said that it was something that one couldn't imagine. He said that the assembled formations would have over 100 airplanes in them sometimes. And they would fly in a formation where a tight packed formation so that the guns of one airplane covered the blind spots on another airplane. So an attacking force was, when it came at a formation, he had nothing but bristling guns pointed at him. And they often shot down the attackers before they got in close enough to attack the bomber formation. He was on a bombing run on the 6th of June, the day of the initial landings on D-Day, over France, when his airplane got hit by something and exploded and blew a couple of them out. The rest of them, including him, seemed to have died in the airplane at the time.
Oh, he passed away on D-Day.
Yeah. Nothing was ever recovered. We never got anything back, but the stuff they took away from him before the mission, they'd make them empty their pockets and take their wallets before they started on a mission.
Where were you when you found out that your brother had passed?
I was D-Day, or at Mobile Bay Harbor.
And when did you find out about your brother?
About that time when we was getting the ship ready to go, but there was
Did your mom call you, or did
the Catholic chaplain came to me, to my barracks, and told me, gave me the news.
What did he
No,
say? How
no,
did he approach you?
He said, I'm sorry to be the bearer of such bad news, but your brother was just lost his life in the landings at Normandy. His airplane blew up in the air. Only two people survived.
And how'd you take it?
Well, tears welled up in my eyes, and I sat there and couldn't think of anything for a while. And I went out and went for a long walk, and I just couldn't believe that he was gone. I couldn't believe that it could be that quick. We were building carriers at a furious pace, and somebody thought that the carriers were too mobile, that they needed a more fixed operation. They couldn't be sunk. So they created a new organization called the Air Repair Unit Floating, Aircraft Repair Unit Floating, ARUF. They had just created the first ARUF, and I was just graduating from the test pilot school, and I didn't have any other assignment. I was waiting to be assigned to something. They assigned me to this first ARUF, which is just an organization on paper at the time.
Right.
And they gave me a couple of other officers, and we were supposed to create a mobile aircraft repair unit, and aircraft repair unit floating. And at the same time, they were building some Liberty ships with repair shops built into the ships,
Right.
and a flat bow with a ramp. They could lower the ramp and tow an airplane into the ship for repair.
Describe how big these Liberty ships are compared to, say, a carrier.
Well, they weren't as big as a carrier, but they were a big cargo ship, and our shops were all aboard, and so the ships weren't even built yet. But so we started training our mechanics and our people, getting the organization together, working out of hangar facilities at Mobile Air Depot. And then when the ship was commissioned and put into service, there was a little bit of a argument there about who would command it, because the Air Force belonged to the Army, and the ship was going to be sailing on the water, and the Navy wanted to control the ARUs, and the Army didn't want the Navy controlling them. So they solved the problem by hiring a merchant marine crew for our ship. We sailed with the fleet, but we didn't. We had a merchant marine crew who were all civilians. They wore pink bars on their shirts, and they took their orders from the Army commander, but they took their sailing orders from the fleet commander. So I was the commander of the squadron that was living on the ship.
So you had to learn how to basically have a lot of diplomacy with a number of different branches of the service.
Yeah, we had to learn to get along with everybody, and of course we trained with the Navy, and we had to learn all the Navy drills. When the Navy's fleet called for drills, we had to do the same thing all the ships were doing. I lived in when we sailed, I lived in a stateroom, had my own stateroom on the ship, and I ate in the officers' quarters, and we had our own mess hall aboard, and a dining room and everything for all of the. We were living high on the hog. Soldiers
Had you
were
married
sleeping
yet?
in foxholes and eating K rations, huh?
Had you married yet?
No,
So you're a single man,
Yeah.
and you're about how many years of age at this point?
23.
23?
22 or 23.
And where are you sailing to in the world?
We first sailed, when we sailed from here, we sailed right to Ulithi Atoll.
From what base here did you
But we
leave?
sailed out of San Diego.
Out of San Diego.
Yeah.
So you're
First out of Mobile, and then around to San Diego, and then we joined a fleet task force in San Diego and sailed for the Marianas. And our particular base was Ulithi Atoll, where we were assigned again. There's a quick change of plans. We were assigned to support a Marine fighter squadron flying Corsairs, which is an entirely different airplane than the one that we were organized to support. We were organized to support C.
So did you have to
C-47.
retool your ship or retool
Pardon?
your repair shop?
We didn't have to retool anything. We just had to get all new books and manuals. They quickly sent out a support package for the Corsairs that we put in our stock rooms aboard the ship, and out in the middle of the Pacific between Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines.
Okay. And the carriers that you were serving, where were they stationed?
they were at sea, and when an airplane was damaged, they would send it. They'd have it land at one of the repair facilities. And they had them land at Ulithi Atoll, where we had our shops.
Would this be a landing immediately after combat? Let's say
Out of combat.
Out of combat.
If they took bullets in combat that looked like they might have done internal damage, they would land the airplane at the atoll, and we'd have to inspect it and repair it and send it back to its unit. We'd go a ways with the fleet, and the fleet would stop, or they'd take a new course, or the fleet stayed at sea, going this way and that, just to maintain secrecy, I guess, so that nobody ever knew exactly where they were.
About how many planes did you do this for during World War II? Any idea?
Well, we were only there on Ulithi for less than a month, maybe half a dozen airplanes we fixed up, and then we were ordered to move forward to another island station.
And which one was this one?
That was Yap, and then from Yap we moved forward to Okinawa, and we went ashore at Naha Airfield in Okinawa, took over an airfield, Japanese airfield facilities, put our shops in there.
So the Navy, Army, and Marines had already cleared Okinawa of.
No, they hadn't. No.
So there was still combat going on.
We went in on right behind the combat wave, lowered the ramp, and hauled our equipment ashore at the port and took it right to the Japanese air base. That was the first thing that we conquered, the air base, and secured it. And the Marines fought their way to the north end of the island and thought they had secured the island, found out that the Japanese just went into an extensive cave network, and they were coming out behind them, so they had to fight their all the way back to the south end of the island again to clear it. So the lines crossed our base twice, once going north and once coming back. And as it came back across, the Japanese were telling the Okinawan civilians that how we would butcher them and horror stories, and they began following the Japanese troops escaping to the south. And when they ran out of land, they just jumped over the cliffs. The whole families, whole hands, jumped over the cliffs, off high cliffs onto rocks, and died, committing family suicide. And that was terrible to witness, because they didn't have to happen.
Did seeing this affect you emotionally, and how did it affect your worldview?
Yeah, it did. It affected me emotionally a great deal, because I saw so many atrocities that didn't need to happen. We always heard about the atrocities the Japanese were perpetrating. They never told us about the ones we were doing. I took the Jeep from our base at Naha and drove east only about 7 or 8 miles. I was looking for a place to get water, and I came on a little village that was still smoldering ruins, and everything in the village had been executed, was all dead. The old women and men, cows and pigs, and there was a young woman with her stomach cut up and her baby dragged out, and another with her breast cut off, and there was an old man that had a pitchfork run under his chin and knocked the back, and then the handle was looped over one bough and under another bough in a tree, and he was swinging in a tree. Things like that just utter barbarity. And we did it. It wasn't the Japanese. It was us.
And does that still go on today, say in Iraq and Afghanistan?
In Iraq too, yeah. You'd very seldom hear about it because they hush it all up, like the one that I heard about. That I understood thoroughly what's going on. There was 2 young men running home, had to cross a bridge, trying to get home before curfew, and 2 American soldiers saw them running, stepped out, shot them, and threw their bodies over into the river, the Tigris River, for no reason at all. No, they knew they were trying to get home before the curfew. They were just getting an enemy, shooting goose.
Is licensed to kill at will. So what did that teach you about
humanity and the mind of humanity?
And the American mentality too?
Well, it taught me that the American mentality is no better than the Japanese mentality or the Chinese mentality. They all are vicious when they're cornered. And there's something about killing that changes people. you never can get over it. And some people get a thrill out of taking the life of somebody else's life, and they get real business. You know, there's so many civilian casualties that don't have to be. They're just shot because they happen to be there, and the soldiers got a gun, like shooting rabbits or something like that. And I don't understand it at all. There was a case where my squadron had set up a tent encampment or quarters around the Naha Air Base, and we had taken a nice area that didn't have any other buildings on it and set up a tent camp. And there was a couple of trees in the middle of our tent camp, and somebody came into my one day and said, there's somebody out there flashing a mirror. We think it's a Japanese spy. And I went out to sit in the yard, and sure enough, there was a young man up in a tree, and he had put the mirror back in his pocket, and it indicated that he was coming down. And the soldiers in my unit were gathering around, and some of them ran to their tents and got their rifles. There's an enemy in camp. There was a guy from New York by the name of Goralski. When he was about halfway down the tree, he shot him point blank, pinned him to the tree, and his body fell out of the tree onto the ground, bounced. And I went over to look at him, and he was mortally wounded. And I looked in his pocket to get an identification, and he had a wallet, just like American soldiers carry, with a picture of his wife and 2 little children. And he was about 25 or 26 years old. His wife was about 20. And love letters with tears on them and everything else. That he had a family and he had relationships and everything. And this guy Goralski just shot him to get an enemy, a trophy. And so I tried to court-martial him, and the only one that got in trouble was me. I tried to court-martial him for murder. He murdered him in cold blood. And the worst part of it is others are standing around jumping up and down saying, oh, you got one, you got one. And that sickened me. That's our mentality. That's human beings. That's American human beings gloating over somebody's death, and he's just like they are. He's got a family and kids. Wasn't doing anything. He was coming down a tree. He had given up. He knew he was trapped. Killed him anyway. But those things happen.
Describe the court-martial process that you tried to go through.
Well, in the service, you have your court is a military court. You file charges, and the charges go to the military judge advocate's office, and he decides whether the charge has merit or not. If it does, he forwards it to the judge advocate, and the judge advocate is a military prosecutor, I guess you'd call it. Mm-hmm. And they appoint senior officers. There's a panel of 3 senior officers as judges on a capital crimes case like that, and the case is presented by the prosecuting attorney, who is an officer, and the defendant is given a defense attorney who has free rein to defend his client to the best of his ability, and the court is run like that, and it's real simple. They keep records on it, but it's a military court. They can even sentence somebody to execution by firing squad if they think necessary. But the senior officer judge panel decided that this is war, and these things happen, and we shouldn't be sitting on a trial like this here in the theater this way, and they dismissed the case. Case of cold-blooded murder.
And so did you fear reprisal from the murderer?
No, but I was reprisal from senior officers that thought I had stepped out of line charging him with murder for killing an enemy.
And what did they say to you? How did they try to...
Well, they just told me that they thought I was out of line, that I should get in step with the rest of the Army.
In other words, tacitly...
Don't make waves.
Don't make waves about cold-blooded murder.
Or anything like that.
And what did that tell you about the upper brass of the military?
Well, they had been through these things something like this before, earlier in their career, and they decided that the system works and it's all right the way it is. We don't need to make big changes in it.
And how did that affect your outlook of being in the military?
I just wanted to get out of the service then, but I was having too much fun flying all those airplanes and things. I didn't do it. We'd been in operation there maybe 2 or 3 months, and I was a captain at the time, and captains are called junior grade officers. All junior grade officers have duty list. You're assigned on a duty roster, and the duty roster includes officer of the day, officer of the guard, things like that that somebody has to fill for a 24-hour period.
Okay.
And in about 2 minutes or much more than that. So take up a heading of such and such, and I'll give you a correction on that in a few minutes. And we did, and we flew for maybe 40 or 45 minutes. And it's just getting daylight when suddenly we were surrounded by about 30 Jack fighters. They were home defense fighters. And I thought, oh man, this is tough. We don't have any. The airplane had been disarmed. There was no guns on the airplane. We didn't even have a pistol or a 45 aboard, and we're surrounded by a sky full of airplanes. And the general said, "They're expecting us. Just do what they say." And the flight leader waggled his wings for him to follow him, and he led us north to Japan and to Atsugi Airfield, just south of Yokohama. And they signaled for us to land first. The airplanes all circled around in a big circle while we did. And then they landed after us. But when we landed, touched down on the runway and started to roll out, a black Model A Ford pulled on the runway, halfway down the runway from us and turned heading down the runway with a sign on the back, great big sign, white lettered in English, "Follow me." And so we followed him, and he led us out around a parking route to a big hangar with the doors open. Motion for us to go inside. We taxied inside, and they closed the doors. Now we're in a Japanese hangar. The doors are closed, and the war's still going on.
And you have absolutely no idea what's going on.
Well, no, I didn't know for sure what was going on. I don't think anybody did.
What was going through your mind? What were you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking now I have to see the next play. The next step. I don't know what's going on here. The general seems to know what we're doing. So after the hangar doors closed, and just a couple of minutes later, they opened again, and a line of black Model A Fords came, about 8 or 9 of them came in through, just wide enough for the cars to come through. And then they closed the door again, and they're all inside, and there's high-ranking admirals and Air Force people, Army, and about, there must have been 8 or 10 high-ranking senior officers with a lot of medals engraved, and there was 4 civilians in diplomatic dress. The gray and black striped pants with the beetle tail coat and a white shirt and a black bow tie and a silk top hat. And they got out, and they all lined up in front of the parked Model A's in some kind of formation. I probably, according to rank, going down the line, because the general, when he got off, he went to the top-hatted guys first, met them, and then was introduced down the line. Then he came back to the door, and he said, "I'm going with these gentlemen." He said, "Here's this fella is a Japanese pilot officer captain. He speaks English very well. He graduated from Harvard or something like that. He'll see that you're taken care of." And then he said, as an afterthought, he says, "And if I'm not back by 5 o'clock, you're on your own." And then he turned and went with him. I was looking at each other, and we said, "What does he mean by that? On our own?" So I guess he thought if they captured him and imprisoned him or something, it's up to us to get away the best way we can. But the captain took us down to the officers' club too. He said, "You may want a bite to eat. It's already getting close to noon." And so we went in the officers' dining hall, and he took us down a chow line, like a cafeteria line, and we got our food and sat at the table, and there was Japanese pilots coming through in flight gear, flight coveralls, and their helmets under their arm, getting lunch too before they took off on their mission. And they'd come over to the table. Here we are sitting there in American Class A uniforms with our ribbons and brass all shined and everything. And they wondered what we were doing there, and we wondered what they thought we were doing there, you know. And our captain introduced us to them and them to us, and they'd tell the captain, tell them we're going to blow their island, blow up their base off the island down there. They got no business on Okinawa. We're going to wipe it out this afternoon. And so they have a big laugh about that. Here we are in the Japanese officers' mess, and the pilots are getting ready to take off to attack my base. And that went on for about 3 days, 4 days, and then the general told us.
So what did you do during those 3 or 4 days?
Oh well.
You must have been a little
No,
anxious.
the generals and the colonel got back in time before 5 o'clock, and they got rooms in the VIP quarters, Japanese VIP quarters, in the officers' barracks there. And they lived in the club. We ate in the officers' dining hall in the club. They were met by senior Japanese officers, picked them up every day, and they went someplace. They were gone most of the day, and they would come back. Now, each day they assigned us to do something. The second day we were there, they told us to go down and supervise the dismantling, or the removal of the propellers on all of the Home Defense Force fighters. They had about 3 squadrons of fighters on the base, and they had been ordered to take the propellers off and lay them on the ground so the airplanes couldn't be started up. And we were supposed to make sure that that happened and then report back to the general when he came in.
So you must have had a good idea that they were negotiating a formal surrender.
Yeah, I'm sure that the Japanese did too. They were expecting them. They came to the hangar and met them. The general knew what he was going to do. He had his orders, his sealed orders. Turned out that the general was, or his son had married General Hap Arnold's daughter. General Hap Arnold was the chief of the Air Force at the time. So he had gone to his son's wife's father, who was a vice president of Douglas Aircraft, which maintained operational relationships with the Japanese throughout the war. The Japanese built engines copied from Douglas versions, and they were by Douglas technology also in the war.
So Douglas Technology made money on both sides of the war.
Oh yeah. So this vice president from Douglas was there representing the United States in the negotiating arrangements for the surrender. Now they had to know that the Japanese wanted to surrender, and in time to have brought this guy out of civilian life, commissioned him as a 2-star general, given him a command, given him orders, given him equipment, given him a schedule, prepared an airplane. That, for something like that, probably took 10 days to 2 weeks. And they had to get all of this done in time for him to start out and be in Okinawa before the war ended. Now, they got there on, the Hiroshima bomb was dropped on the 8th, and they landed on the 9th. And so we didn't have to drop the bomb, because they already knew that the surrender team was on its way. Our negotiating team, the surrenders that the Japanese had asked for, was on its way, and we dropped the bomb anyway. But they still wanted terms, and we were there to negotiate the terms. They dropped the bomb while the team was en route, so the Japanese knew that we had a team en route, and then we dropped the bomb. And the bomb was so devastating that the Japanese had no heart to continue the war. I think they dropped the second one just to make sure the Japanese weren't going to get a change of heart and back out of their whatever negotiations they had asked for, because they immediately accepted unconditional surrender after that. You know what I found most interesting is we captured 2 atomic bombs that the Germans had built in the tunnels east, the Harz Mountains tunnels east of Peenemünde, and they were completely intact. They were waiting to be delivered to Norway, where some special German bombers had been built to carry them on one-way missions to New York and Washington. And the target date for dropping on New York and Washington was 19 September of 1945, and we dropped them on Japan in August of 1945.
Do you think the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and atomic bomb development programs
Had to follow that.
were they Were they far enough along to have really been originated out of the those programs?
I don't see how they could be. We had our test explosion only 3 weeks earlier at White Sands Missile Test Range. 3 weeks before we dropped the first one on Hiroshima. And it must have taken 10 days to 2 weeks to get the bomb from the United States to Tinian Island and on the cities. So that leaves us a week for development. Do you think we developed an atomic bomb from a test vehicle to an operational device? And two different ones. The first test vehicle was a hydrogen bomb. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was a uranium bomb, and the one dropped on Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb. 3 different bombs entirely. Completely different systems. Did we make them all? I don't know. I don't think we had a chance of making that much more. We didn't even have. We had a problem getting enough heavy water to carry off the tests in New Mexico. And we didn't have enough heavy water until we captured a supply in a German submarine on its way to Japan with heavy water for their development program, and that was enough to finish the test vehicle off so they could explode it. The interesting thing is, those same bombs, the Germans had a schedule on those bombs. They were going to be dropped on New York and Washington on the 19th of September of the same year, and they had 6 specially built Focke-Wulf bombers, heavy bombers, for one-way flights to drop one on New York and one on Washington, and then they go out to sea and ditch and be picked up by submarines, crews. And the airplanes were, we found the airplanes in northern Norway with German crews maintaining them all the time, waiting for the bombs to come up and be loaded. So I think we dropped the German bombs on Japan and stole their thunder. We told our public that they were our bombs when they in fact were not. We couldn't possibly have built those bombs. When we found the bombs there, we sent our big bombers over in teams to make them, to modify their mounting so we could get them in our bombers. And we sent 3 bombers to pick each bomb up. And they were loaded at night with outside of the side of the airplane crews. The airplane crews didn't assist in the loading. They were loaded by technicians. And each airplane crew, one of them was the real bomb, and 2 of them were dummies. And none of the crews knew who had the real bomb and who had the dummies. All 3 of them came back to States. And they landed at SAC headquarters, where they took the real bomb, re-prepared it, and shipped it out.
Now, this information, how did you acquire this information?
Oh, from over a long time, from different correspondents and different eyewitnesses that were interested in the development of the atomic sciences, mostly Polish and German sources that weren't in sympathy with the Nazi Party and with Germany's attempts to conquer Europe. Of course, when it failed, they always could say, "I told you so." But they, for their own purposes, they went to great pains to try to determine facts. What did we capture? Where did we capture it? And they were working from the side of the party that lost the bombs, lost the equipment, lost the technology. And they were concerned about where it was going and what we were going to do with it. And then they found out we dropped it on Japan. So I had people tell me that were familiar with the bomb that the Germans worked on, that was the shape and style that we captured. And then when I looked, if you look at the World Almanac and look at the time of the first test and the time of the drop on Hiroshima, there's not enough time to build a bomb. There's hardly enough time to get it in an airplane and haul it out there. The Manhattan Project developed bombs, but they came much later. They came after the war ended, before we got our first bomb that we developed in the Manhattan Project. Their objective was to do the same thing, but they just weren't that far along.
But there is nothing in the history books that I'm aware of.
Well, because our history is not very accurate anyway. I flew a Nordwind Norseman to Hiroshima.
And what was your experience there?
Well, the city was still smoking, by the way. There was smoke plumes all over the place. What surprised me is the center of the city looked swept clean. The streets weren't littered. They were blown clean of debris, clear of debris. There's room enough to land the Nordwind on a street without encountering obstructions.
So in the center where the bomb was dropped,
Yeah,
it was just
dropped from ground zero out of maybe a half a mile.
and it was just clean of any debris.
Yeah,
Of,
buildings were gone and the debris
and probably
was gone.
of people too.
All people were gone. I was surprised at the devastation because as far as you could see, it was buildings were down and buildings were smoking and burning.
Had you ever seen anything
No.
comparable in any German war footage or Dresden or anything? Had you ever seen anything
No,
comparable?
no, I hadn't.
Calling in Ola Gay. Weather's fair and clear over Hiroshima. You are go for bomb run.
Roger, Easterly. Standing by to drop on target.
I better get going or I'll be late for school. See you later.
You're coming right home after school, because we're going down to the river, right?
Right.
Promise?
I promise.
Father, Aiko, you won't believe this.
What is it? Good heavens.
Look at all the ants. Where are they coming from? I've never seen so many.
I wonder why.
B-29.
Yeah.
Gee, and it's all alone.
What's it doing?
Probably a spy mission.
It's very strange. So why isn't the air raid siren going off?
I don't know.
Altitude, nearing 3,600 feet.
We've got a fix on the target, sir. Standing by to release payload. Roger. Release the bomb. Releasing bomb.
Wow, what happened? How'd I end up here? I guess they finally decided. What a mess. Hang on, I'm coming! She's dead! Hey! Somebody help! Is anybody here? What's happened? Are they ghosts or what? Fire! My house is on fire! Oh, please, not my house! I'm coming! Father, Mother, Echo! Shinji! Hey! Shinji, where are you? Is anyone here? Where are you? Please, Mother! Somebody help us! That's Mother's voice! Somebody help me, hurry! Mother! What happened?
Oh, my sweet boy, you're alive!
Hurry, Mother! Get us out! It really hurts!
Echo! Father!
Hurry, then! Help me lift this baby! Oh. Help me!
Yes, Lord!
Hurry up, kid! It's getting hotter! Do it fast! It really hurts bad! It's so hot! Hurry, kid! I'm scared! I'm scared!
It won't move!
We'll get him out! We have to!
That's enough! Go on! Get away!
What are you saying?
Get out now! Go while you can!
No, darling, no! I won't! Never!
Kimie! Listen to me, you've got to go while you can!
Never! I would rather die!
Kimie, you're talking like a fool! You've got Gen and the baby to think of now!
No, I won't! I will never leave you!
Gen! You know what you have to do now, son!
What do you want me to do, Father?
Get your mother out of here! Now!
No, Father! I won't do it!
I'm scared!
It's okay, Shinji.
Echo!
Mother, please. Mother!
I'm so weak! Oh, why couldn't I be stronger?
Gen! It's up to you to look after your mother and the baby from now on. They're going to need you, boy. I know you. Do your best now.
They're all burning up. My family. Burning.
This was a Japanese sentry.
Sentry, yeah. So I went through the gate, unmolested, then turned down the road. I'm the only one on the road walking along, and my pinks and greens are carrying a little bundle of laundry, and I could see ahead of me, looking towards Yokohama, everything was blackened and still smoldering, smoke plumes here and there, and just charred black. Everything was burned out. And I thought, how can people live through that? There's no structure big enough to be a building, nothing, anybody could live in. And I came on a couple of little kids that were standing there. They were about 5 years old, a little boy and girl, and they were just standing there by the side of the road, and there's no parents around or anything else. And as I came by, they smiled and did like that, and I felt so terrible about what we do to people. And they didn't have any. They didn't want to murder me. They didn't have anything else to do but to try to be acknowledged, and they were trying to be polite. And I guess the parents were killed in the bombing. I was down the road. I could see more children. I could see an occasional person moving in the debris, probably looking for survivors or food or clothing. And then I came to the farmhouse, but it was just so devastating. I can't believe that we load hundreds of bombers with incendiary bombs and drop them on a city that has all wood buildings and wood sidewalks to set them on fire. The fire is so great, with the massed fire like that produces what they call a firestorm. And so much air is being lifted out of the area by the heat that it rushes in from the side to fill the gap at hurricane force and blows things away, blows them into the center where they get burned up and go up in plume again. And I don't see how anybody can survive those firestorms, because they're so hot that people just burst into flame when the wave hits them. And we did that night after night. Different cities. When we did it to Berlin, there's some pictures of this firestorm in Berlin where you see the hurricane force winds and people being blown into the fire by the hurricane. They can't buck the hurricane force wind, and they're just blown into the center of it.
So this really scarred you.
Oh yeah, we planned that for somebody. Our strategists planned that. That was no accident.